Tigran Petrosian uses a space advantage to control the board in this game from the 1953 Candidates Tournament, one of the most famous tournaments in chess history. His opponent is Laszlo Szabo. So let us look at this exploration of Petrosian's mastery of space in chess. Szabo has the white pieces, Petrosian has black. Szabo begins with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and d5. Petrosian takes a classical approach to the Queen's Gambit, the decline variation, and basically what he's saying is that he doesn't want to concede any space at all in the center of the board, no more than he has to. Bishop g5, pinning the knight on f6. Petrosian just relieves that pin with bishop to e7, e3, so that the bishop at f1 can develop. Castles, knight to f3, and h6. Petrosian asks a question of the bishop at g5. Do you want to save yourself, or do you want to take the knight on f6? The bishop goes to h4. And so now the question is, as it almost always is for black and the Queen's Gambit declined, how do you deal with the Queen's bishop? Because this pawn at e6 blocks that bishop in. Petrosian decides to play b6. This way the bishop can develop to b7. It can also move to a6, depending on the circumstances. And the b6 move also supports a c5 push later to get a claim of that central space. Bishop to d3, Szabo puts his bishop on a natural square. Bishop to b7, castles, and knight b to d7. So we can see Petrosian doesn't want to concede anything. He doesn't want to concede space or development. All four of his minor pieces are already developed, just as white's are. And here, rook to c1 was played. The idea is that white is anticipating taking on d5 and having this half-open c-file open up. So he wants his rook placed on c1 before that happens, ready to control the file. Petrosian plays c5. Again, not conceding 1 ounce of space. He wants his equal share of space in the center, now with pawns at c5 and d5 to match white's pawns at c4 and d4. cd5 can be played here, but after knight takes d5, black has a fairly decent score from this position. So Szabo plays queen to e2, basically developing the queen and allowing the rook on f1 to come to d1, where it would face off against black's queen and just complete his development comfortably. Petrosian plays a6, an interesting idea. The idea is essentially to take on c4 and play b4. If you take on c4, bishop takes, and b5, and gain space on the king's side. So first thing that white does is he takes on d5, and Petrosian responds with e d5. Again, you can play knight to d5. It's probably even a bit safer, but Petrosian's approach, he wants to get as much space as he possibly can, so he takes with the pawn, and already we can see, even though he has the black pieces, Petrosian already has a little bit more space than white does. One of white's options here, a fairly strong option, would have been knight to e5, with the idea of playing f4 and playing it sort of like a stonewall attack, but instead he plays dc5, and Petrosian takes bc5. So now Petrosian has more space on than his opponent, clearly. And with the black pieces, it's harder to get a space advantage with black than with white, but in order to get that space advantage, he's had to make a bit of a concession. What he has here on c5 and d5 are what are known as the hanging pawns. So it gives black more space, but these pawns can become a target for attack. And if white can get one of them to advance, it will weaken the square. So if the pawn advances to c4, it will weaken the d4 square, for example. But Petrosian has his space advantage. Rook f to d1, rook to e8. Now his rook faces white's queen. The bishop moves to c2, looking for a more active location. The bishop can go to b3, attacking the d5 square, or to a4, pinning the knight on d7. Petrosian plays queen to b6. The queen supports perhaps an eventual push to d4, gaining more space, and he also directly attacks the pawn on b2 for the moment. So white plays bishop to b3, blocking the queen's attack of b2 and also attacking the pawn on d5. Petrosian has to do something about that, so he plays the move c4, gaining even more space and hitting the bishop at b3 with tempo. The downside is he does weaken this d4 square, and white might be able to place a piece there, and that piece would be quite well placed. But for the moment, he has to do something about his bishop at b3. That bishop does go to a4, pinning the knight on d7 to the rook. And the threat here is bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, knight takes d5, winning a key central pawn. So in order to stop that, Petrosian just goes ahead and plays the bishop to c6 to neutralize the active bishop at a4. Bishops do come off the board. The queen goes to c6. And we see Petrosian still has a very nice space advantage in the center of the board, even though he's given up some control over the dark squares. Now, in this position, probably White's best move was knight to d4, taking advantage of the d4 square, hitting the queen with tempo. But he decides instead to play b3, directly attacking the front of the pawn chain that Petrosian has placed in the middle of the board when he gained that space. But this move makes Black's life a little bit easier. Not only is White weakening key dark squares like c3 and b4, he's removing the defense of the knight at c3. The pawn no longer defends the knight. And he's also allowing the bishop to go to b4 or a3 to irritate the rook at c1. So there are some concessions with this move. Rook a to c8, holding on to that c4 pawn for that space. Knight to a4. Now the rook is creating a pin on the c pawn, but other than that, I'm not sure why he played knight to a4 in this position. Queen to b5. Now this sets up a little trap. Black is threatening to take on b3. So if he takes here, then the queens are opposing each other, and the knight at a4 is threatened, so the queens would really need to come off. Pawn takes, and now the knight is under attack. If it moved to c3, then Black would have this nasty little tactic. He just plays b2, hitting the rook on c1. The rook has to go to c2 to keep defending the knight on c3, but then knight to e4 takes advantage of the pin on the knight, and with the pawn at b2, White would totally be lost in that position. So he moves the knight back to c3, gaining a tempo on the queen at b5. The queen moves to a5, putting pressure on the a2 pawn as well as the knight at c3. Bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and now pawn takes c4. Trying to create an isolated weakness on c4 after Petrosian recaptures. But that space is still quite troublesome. And for the moment, he controls the d3 square. But White plays knight to d2. Now he's attacking the pawn at c4 twice. And in this position, Petrosian decides to give up the pawn for pressure down the c-file. So he's moved from controlling a space with a pawn, or two pawns, to controlling it with pieces. So rook to c6, sacrificing that pawn at c6. Jabo takes the pawn. Obviously, he's hitting the queen at the moment, but Petrosian plays the queen back to c7. And now we see this pressure down the c-file is really hard to deal with. He's threatening to capture the c4 knight at the moment. So the knight at c3 moves to a4 to allow the rook at c1 to become an additional defender of the knight. But now rook to c8, tripling up on the c-file, putting tremendous pressure on the knight at c4. And now Jabo has to make a very awkward move. Rook to d4 defends that rook. Actually, the best move for him was knight a to b6, defending in that way. And after rook takes knight, knight takes, then queen takes c1. And if knight takes c8, the queen just comes back to c8. And this is a fairly equal endgame. Basically, White has a rook and a pawn in exchange for two minor pieces. That's a fairly equal position. But Jabo instead directly defends the knight at c4 by playing rook to d4. And now knight to e8, a very strong move. He wants to play the knight to d6 to put even more pressure on that knight. And all this pressure again on the pin against that c1 rook. And also the bishop can go to f6 to hit the rook at d4. So here was White's last chance to hold on. Basically, queen to d1 was the move he needed to play. And after knight d6, knight a to b6, hits the rook at c8, defends the knight at c4. After rook takes knight, knight takes, queen to c1, then knight takes, then queen takes c8. And we have a similar ending to what we just saw, basically two minor pieces versus rook and pawn. By the way, White cannot capture twice on d6 because queen to c1 would be a back rank mate. But instead, Jabo plays the move e4. But now his rook is lacking squares. So Petrosian plays bishop to f6, immediately attacking the rook on d4, and Jabo has to sacrifice a pawn to save that rook so that he now has some places to move along the fourth rank. Bishop takes e5. The bishop cannot be taken because of this pin on the c-file, but would just cost him the game. So rook to e4, but now knight to f6, and this rook is still running out of squares. In this position, if he plays the rook to h4, then black can just play g5. And after rook takes h6, rook takes c4, black wins the knight and the game. If instead he takes on e5 here, then rook takes knight at c4, exchanging on c4. Here, if queen to d1, defending the knight at a4, then just queen can take the knight. Because if queen takes queen, rook to c1 is a back rank mate. I mean, he can block it twice with his queen and rook, but he's going to be mated. And if queen takes c4, then just rook takes, and there's a threat to the knight and a threat of rook to c1 with the mate on the back rank. So to try to survive this position, Jabo plays the move knight a to b6, again attacking the rook and defending the knight on c4, but now rook to b6. If knight takes b6 here, then queen takes c1 check, and if queen to e1, just knight to e4 is completely winning for black. So instead he takes the bishop on e5, but now the rook comes back to c6, and the pin is decisive now. There's just no further way to defend the knight on c4. Rook to e7 counterattacks the queen at c7, but he ignores it and just plays rook takes c4. If white were to take the queen, then Petrosian would play rook to c1 check. After rook c1, rook takes c1 check, the queen would be forced to block, and now you just exchange, and he's just left with a whole knight in the endgame. Obviously, that would be it. If rook takes c4, then queen c4, and it's the same thing. He's still up an entire knight in the endgame. So what Jabo decides to do is avoid the exchanges. He says, if I'm going to be down a minor piece, I should at least keep my heavy pieces on the board to try to stir up complications. So queen to c6 to move away from the rook's attack, h3 to avoid the back rank threats, rook to c1. Because there's a pin here, at least one pair of rooks is forced off of the board. Rook takes c1, queen takes c1 check, the king moves to h2. Queen to c4, of course, Petrosian being up a minor piece wants to trade off everything else, but Jabo avoids that with queen to f3. Queen takes a2 now, and he's added a passed pawn at a6 to his collection. After rook to a7 from Jabo, Jabo actually went ahead and resigned before Petrosian responded, seeing that he was completely lost in this position. I hope you've enjoyed the game, this exhibition on how Petrosian used space to dominate the game of chess. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.